So good morning, everybody. My name is Stenka Piskulic, and I am the co-chair of the Environmental Funds Working Group, which, as you know, is a working group within the Conservation Finance Alliance. The purpose of this working group is to help highlight the work that environmental funds are doing throughout the globe and to make sure that we can carry the message across about the importance of financial sustainability through the work that we do and the efforts that we have done around the globe, and to make sure that we can carry this message across to the adequate audiences. So we're constantly seeking to raise awareness, to disseminate updated information on environmental funds in international fora, and to raise the profile of environmental funds and position them as key actors in meeting the 2030 vision. As part of these efforts, the Environmental Funds Working Group has been charged with a new task, which is to develop a series of webinars in which we will discuss the practice standards for conservation trust funds. So this is the first of a series of webinars which will happen the third week of each month, in which we will have the possibility to understand each one of the new practice standards that has been developed with the support of the Conservation Finance Alliance and the Environmental Funds Working Group. And not only to share the information in theory, but also to invite conservation trust funds who are actually applying these standards to share their experience as to how this process has been, and also to bring in perspectives from others, whether it's donors or experts, in terms of the importance of these practice standards. So today we're going to kick off this whole series of webinars. Here you have a list of the future webinars that will be happening. As you can see, they will happen the third week. Next month, we will be discussing programs, monitoring and evaluation. The month after that, communications, and so on, each month. And then in October, when we end our discussion of each one of these practice standards, we will be having a discussion on how we can use these standards as environmental funds, how we can provide an assessment and a self-assessment as well, in terms of how our environmental funds are complying with these different practice standards. And this is something that both REDLAC and CFA are supporting, and will be supporting the development of these tools over the next months. So by October, after we learn about all these practice standards, we'll have the capacity to use a tool to see how our environmental funds are actually applying these standards. So this will be a year in which we will be seeing each other every month. I hope all of you can join us. And we will also send the calendar out to all of you, not only so that you can participate, but also if you would like to be a speaker for one of these sessions and you have information that you think you can share from your group and from your perspective in one of these sessions, we would very much welcome an active participation as we move forward through these webinars this year. So moving on to today's agenda. Today, we will be learning some of the highlights of the 2020 edition of these practice standards, of these new practice standards that were launched. And then we will share a first case study, in this case, the case study of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and then hear from the donor perspective in terms of the importance of these standards. And finally, open up to a Q&A in which all of you can ask your questions and participate. Because of the format that we are using, I would ask all of you please to remain with your phones on mute and your cameras off while we go through these presentations. Please feel free to use the chat section to ask your questions, and Katie Mathias will be helping us channel these questions, which we can then ask our panelists at the end of their presentation. So we will go through the three presentations and then open it up for questions from all of you. Each one of the participants will have approximately 8 minutes for their presentation. So moving on, first I'd like to thank all the donors who have made this possible, all of those who appear on screen, who have been collaborating and supporting this work and who have made the development of these practice standards possible. And finally, I'd also like to thank the task force. As you can see, there's a lot of names in this list. These are all experts who have contributed throughout this whole process as these practice standards were developed, and who have participated in this process. So thank you to all of you. I hope most of you are joining us today to see the end product also of all of your support. Finally, I would like to present today's speakers. I'm also very proud to see this is an all-female phenomenal women webinar. And we will first hear from Paquita Bath, who's the president of Aligning Visions, and from Viviana Lujan, who is a conservation finance specialist with Wolf's Company. Both Paquita and Viviana were involved in the development of these practice standards and will share their lessons and highlights with all of you. And then we will welcome Karen McDonald, who is the program manager for the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and who will be giving you a case study, an example of how these standards are being applied in the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. And then finally, I'd like to welcome Vanessa Hartman, who's the portfolio manager for Latin American Caribbean of KFW, who will be offering us a donor perspective into this process. So that being said, I first give the floor to Paquita. Paquita, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Can you hear me? I can't start my video, so Kumar, if you could please undo my video, that would be great. So welcome. It has been such a pleasure to work with Wolf's Company and with the full task force on this 2020 practice standards. It's an update. So what we wanted to do was walk you through what's different about this particular version than the 2014 version, and let you know kind of where the big changes are. So next slide, please. So what we're going to do today is talk about the changes from 2014, how this is also aligned with the 10-year review. We have 4 new sets of standards, so we'll go into some detail about what those particular new core areas are, and then look briefly at some of the annexes. So that's the plan of how we're going to approach this. Next. So the idea for the 2020 update was that the 2014 book was just extremely successful. It really raised the bar for conservation trust funds around the globe. But as always happens, there was a lot of new initiatives taking place. And so there was a need to think about an update. But a few things that were set during the 2014 standards were clearly needed to be continued. One, that this is really a set of voluntary standards. We highly encourage groups to look at them. But some are more useful than others in different places, at different time frames, et cetera. So we see this as very much a voluntary set of standards for your consideration. This is a tool that will help current conservation trust funds, both new ones that are being designed, current ones that want to look at their management, and those who want to evaluate their process, either by external evaluators or internally. These standards all give you that opportunity. And we believe it really serves as donors as well, both in evaluating and in considering how to support conservation trust funds in their capacity. So next. So the 2014 practice standards, many of these things stayed the same. Kathy and Barry developed these organizing principles, such as what are the current reasons for this standard? What are the practical considerations that require changing over time? We kept all of that same organizational principle because they'd just proven so useful in the 2014 standards. A number of conservation trust funds over the last couple of years had been reporting areas where they would like to see additional standards. And so those were the new 4 key areas that we'll be discussing. We did edit a number of the existing standards based on input from conservation trust funds, and we did a lot of interviews with people. And so we got all of this input on areas that people wanted to see a little bit more expansion of the practical considerations or small changes. And then we also did a regrouping of some of the core areas, and I'll walk you through that. The biggest regroup was changing operations to a combination of institutional effectiveness as a core area and programs, because there was just so much in those key areas. And then we developed a series of cross-cutting themes. So these are kind of the major similarities and changes from 2014 version. Next. We had the pleasure, Wolf's Company and I, working on this to also get to work with the task force on the 10-year review of conservation trust funds. So the idea was to try to minimize having to interview people twice, 3 times, and to actually integrate these 2 different products. But it required us to also try to make sure that we were saying the same things and using the same language. So both of them really looked at the evolution of conservation trust funds and their roles over time and helping to incorporate that into the standards as well. There was some vocabulary that we really tried to stay consistent. I think the biggest one that I want to call your attention to is the term program accounts. In the past, we had always used the term funds for different amounts of money that conservation trust funds manage for different donors and for different purposes. But because we use the same term funds for everything, it got very confusing. So we're now saying a conservation trust fund often manages many different program accounts. That could be a debt swap account or a KfW account, or different types of funding that they have to manage separately for different donors or for different projects. So that's a new term that we've used in both of these books. The standards have always really emphasized the importance of independent conservation trust funds. We recognize that there's a lot of government managed or government led or quasi-governmental conservation trust funds that are doing very well, and many of them are working very hard to apply the standards. But there's still a real advantage to having that independent leverage for working with the government. And many of the donors really value seeing that independence over time to help with transitions between administrations. So that's something else that was really emphasized here. And finally, as always happens over the last 6 years since the 2014 version became available, conservation trust funds are innovative groups. They're constantly doing new things. So the standards also include things about private sector engagement, much more attention to accreditation, sustainable development goals. All of these types of ideas are now incorporated into the standards and into the 10-year review. Next. So the way the original 2014 standards had 6 core areas, we now have 7. Governance, institutional effectiveness, and programs came out of what was operations. They got divided into 2 sections. Administration, asset management, and resource mobilization maintained the same with some additions and small edits. And then a new core area in risk management and safeguards was managed, was added. So we now have 7 core areas. Next. So so we now have 4 cross-cutting themes that cut across all of these areas: communications, human resources, technology, and then what was a core area, monitoring and evaluation, we made into a cross-cutting, because actually you can look at monitoring and evaluation across asset management, across resource mobilization, obviously across programs. And so this is really where we ended up, is kind of these 7 core areas and these 4 cross-cutting themes, trying to make sure that we had communications integrated into all the core areas, technology integrated where we could, et cetera. So all in all, there was 19 new standards added in the 2020 version. And we very much look forward to seeing how people will be able to apply that. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Viviana Lujan from Wolf's Company, to walk you through kind of more of the specific details in each of these core areas.
Thank you very much, Paquita, for that great introduction. Can I have the next slide, please? So as Paquita mentioned, we added this new core area, risk management. In the evaluation of the update, we discussed whether all the other cross-cutting themes could be a new core area or not, and they ended up being cross-cutting themes. But risk management stood out for most of the people we interviewed as something that was key to be highlighted as a new core area, because there was a need expressed by Ctfs and the founders of the standards to be able to have a guide to help Ctfs to identify policies, procedures, to be able to address risk and adopt national, internationally used environmental and social safeguards. This new core area also came about from the experience of many Ctfs in their accreditation processes with multilateral financing mechanisms like the GEF, the World Bank, the GCF, And the idea is, on the other hand, that new CTFs that are going to embark in that accreditation process will also be able to use this risk management and safeguards to go through that process easier. So that's like the input and output of hoped for this standard. In terms of the themes that are covered, you will not recognize these topics that are highlighted in blue, except for the last two, as a standard on itself. Gender mainstreaming is a standard, and whistleblower protections is a standard, but the other ones are basically covered through all the 7 new standards. And we talk about policies, procedures, guidelines, because each CTF will have already their way of translating these standards into their own documents, manuals, etc. And basically the idea is to give a guide of which are the things they need to look into when they are developing all the risk management and safeguards policies, procedures, or guidelines. Next, please. Communications, as Paquita mentioned, is one of the new cross-cutting themes, and is highlighted through most of the standards because of the importance that it has. The 2014 standards already had a couple of communication standards, mainly regarding reporting to audiences, conveying values, programs, and complying with donor reporting requirements. And the new standards basically add aspects about delegation, which staff is tasked with communicating, basically being able to mainstream communications, internet and online presence, how CTFs can really communicate their missions, their values throughout, and also being able to put all this together into a comprehensive communication policy. Human resources, as you see, is the largest, I think, of the cross-cutting themes with 12 standards. Most of the new human resource standards are found in the administration core area, and some of them are also found in the risk management core area. And they basically address how CTFs organize and support their staff to be able to advance their mission and goals of the organization. Again, as Paquita mentioned, HR is embedded into all the different core areas, so it was found more useful to have it as a cross-cutting theme than as a new standard. It keeps some of the existing standards, of course, like having a full-time CEO, having HR policies to conform to country laws, and it added new standards referring to having clear organization charts, having clear annual goals and performance reviews of staff to improve, of course, on the other hand, the performance of the CTF as a whole, taking care of the safety and well-being of staff members and protect whistleblowers. The last cross-cutting theme that was addressed, the new one, because as Paquita mentioned, monitoring and evaluation was already included, just changed from a core area to a cross-cutting theme, is technology. There was a lot of discussion about technology, and as people that have used the standards and know the previous version, the idea of the standards is not to tell CTFs how to do things, but provide a guide into what are the things they should consider in their operations. Therefore, these are not very extensive, but provide a broad umbrella to look into internal controls and policies to manage technology use, how to increase efficiencies in operations, and how to minimize risks in this digital age. Where doing business is very different than 20 or 30 years ago. So all these standards are included again in the administration team, most of them, and 2 in the programs core area, and they cover mainly aspects of cybersecurity, presence online or internet, how to streamline or standardize operations, or using online systems, for example, for grant making, to make things more efficient but also more accessible to for example, grantees. and also the importance of keeping up-to-date software for key functions like accounting, financial management, contract management. And then again, this all with the idea to enhance the operation and the work of CTFs. If we look at the annexes, I'm going to highlight in the next slides 1, 2, and 4. The only thing I wanted to mention here is that on Annex 3, users will find a very handy list of all the cross-cutting themes that I just mentioned, plus monitoring and evaluation, and basically which are the standards that relate to each of these cross-cutting themes. So you don't have to go and look them up on the document by yourself. And this will help key staff on each of the CTF to look at which are the standards that are more relevant for their work, of course. Or if you want to do a special audit on a theme or whatever, this will help you go quickly through those areas. And then I don't know if, can I go back, Kumar, please? One more. I don't know if Paquita mentioned it in detail, but one of the new things of these edited practice standards is that the glossary is now only at the end of the document. In the previous version of the standards, you will have a glossary on each of the core areas, which was very useful because when you were looking at a word that was related to that core area, you would be able to just go 1 or 2 pages back to look for it. But when we were doing the streamlining, we found that it was sometimes difficult because one term could have 2 definitions depending on which core area you were using them, or you would have to define one term more than once. So we kept the principle of having a bold defined term that refers to the glossary in each of the core areas when there is explained. For example, program accounts that Paquita mentioned, which is mentioned across the whole document. And then you can go and find that word in one place, one glossary at the end. If you're using the PDF version, then you can click on it, that will bring you to the glossary, and then you'll have to use the PDF table of contents or back view to go back to the document. So of course, if you have it printed, it is easier than online. But hopefully this will be a useful change for users. So Annex 1, as Paquita mentioned, we did the review of these standards hand in hand with, and at the same time with the 10-year review. So while working on the 10-year review, we used a set of stages of CTF development. Can you click next, Kumar, please? Thanks. Or the previous, yeah, thanks. So we using some authors, some practitioners like Javanex Batista have similar qualification. We came up this with in interviews, in literature, and CTFs also came with the question like, is there a way to know which practice standards I need to use on which stage? So these stages of evolution, pre-registration, startup, operational, institutional, and termination are also being used in the 10-year review to describe aspects like funding, resource mobilization, partnerships, etc., so that you can see how all these different aspects evolve through the life of CTFs. Similar in the practice standards, Kumar, can I have the next one, please? The next click, yes. So this is just an example. You will see for each of the core areas a similar table where based on interviews and expert input, we have defined, or actually it's a suggestion of which practice standards CTFs could focus on each of the stages of evolution. So if I give you an example here, for example, you could see that you're gonna prepare a strategic and financial plan when you're starting up. You won't do that when you're only registering your fund. And if you look, for example, Institutional Effectiveness Standard 4, which is about monitoring and evaluating your programs, is something that you don't do when you're pre-registering your fund or when you're only in the startup phase, when you're maybe just starting to mobilize funds, but only when you're operational and actually making the disbursements of the funding on the ground. And again, this is just a guide to assist CTFs who find this useful. But of course, we are not discouraging, or the CFA or any of the funders, that all CTFs take into account all the practice standards when they are designing the CTF from start. So this is just to help those that find it difficult to be able to define which ones to focus on because of lack of resources or staff, etc. So if we go to the next annex, which is the assessing of the use of standards of CTFs, we were really lucky and are very grateful to have received a set of examples from different CTFs and from donors of how CTFs have external assessment and evaluation of the use of the practice standards, or self-assessments of how donors use the practice standards to do assessments or of appraisals. And based off that, this annex provides in the introduction a set of considerations of what kind of methods, considerations, issues CTFs can face or apply when they are going to do a self-assessment or ask for an external assessment. And I really encourage all of you to go through these introductory remarks before jumping in to use this example we provided. And then to make things a bit more practical, we provided this example of how CTFs could use the practice standards as a self-assessment tool or a tool for an external assessment. So basically what we did was take each of the core areas again, write down the program standards, what is the evidence of compliance or achievement of each of the standards, which is also found in the standards themselves, and then define a very very simple scale from satisfactory implemented, partially implemented, not implemented, nor applicable, and comments. Then again, this will be up to you. And I just want to show you the last thing of this slide, which is basically how this could be scored. So this again is just an example, and you can find an Excel tool on the website as well to download. If I go to the next slide really quick, Kumar, thanks. This is just an example of the transposition table we prepared. So people are able to find where the previous standards they have already used, applied, implemented. So if you click quickly, Kumar, through the arrows, it shows you where there are new standards, where there are existing ones, so you can compare as well. And just to close, because I'm running over time, the next slide, we just wanted to highlight that the standards basically reinforce the importance of CTFs and their reputation and their work quality. And what we have written here is basically all the really important roles that the CTFs play in achieving conservation, climate, and development agendas, which is also a result of the conclusion of our thank you review. Thank you very much. I think I'll give the word now to Karen.
Yes, thank you very much, Paquita and Viviana, for your presentation. I would like to give the floor now to Karen to give an example of how this has been actually put into practice by the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. Karen, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Just to first congratulate and thank the team that worked on the new practice standards. I was a member of the working group, and the balance between the participatory method and involving those of us who work on the ground with the trust funds and the standards and the new writing was indeed a pleasure for me to watch and observe. And the final product is shows that participation. So thank you. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and how we used what would be now the old practice standards, but indeed how it will develop into the use of the new practice standards as well, and the value of the practice standards overall. Next slide. Just very quickly, in terms of background, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, CBF, was started in 2012. And it's a regional organization, a regional conservation trust fund. When we started in 2012, you saw Yabanex Batista's name mentioned. He's our chief executive officer, and he will tell you all the time that he was the only staff member for a number of years. So we're a small team working on the various aspects of the CBF. There is a portfolio that works on climate change, one that's coming up working on the circular economy, and the conservation finance program that I manage that works with the endowment fund. One of the key results for the endowment fund was the establishment of the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture, which is the CBF, the development and evolution of the CBF, as well as the development and evolution of national conservation trust funds. And the idea behind the National Conservation Trust Funds was indeed that they were standalone independent conservation trust funds that we at the CBF helped to develop and create in the early stages. And then we would be, they would then exist on their own to conduct their business for national and regional conservation trust fund, conservation goals and needs. And so that was the concept behind the CBF. And indeed, if you go to the next slide, it also gives you a sense of how we use the practice standards, being a small team and working ahead. Very quickly, just to show you, we started with 8 countries. Dominican Republic is in red. It is the only country that we worked with of those original 8 that had an existing conservation trust fund. So the other 7, we worked to help the countries to establish their conservation trust funds. And as you can see, that's in 2015. And next slide. And today in 2021, we have 12 countries that we are working with. And of those, 2 have existing trust funds. The others, we have worked with the countries to develop their national conservation trust funds. So the role of the practice standards in this process really was important. It gave us that menu, that recipe of what a trust fund should look like. As Viviana and Paquita both mentioned, at various stages, some of the practice standards were more important than others. Certainly the governance ones were some of the early ones that we leaned to. But again, with a small team, it gave us the reference document that we needed for these early interactions with both the stakeholders setting up the conservation trust fund, as well as with the teams that were then hired to manage the trust funds. Next slide. Just to give you a little bit more on the role of the CBF with the trust funds, we helped with direct support. We helped with the sharing of documents and templates and designing documents relevant to each country's specific needs and cultures and legal requirements. And then of course, we share those between the various trust funds that we work with as a network. And we also provided capacity building and support of opportunities for sharing the work of the trust funds. Next slide. One of the things that I'm glad Viviana started with and was mentioned, and this is probably an earlier version to the later version that she just showed, is trying to explain how the trust funds developed from the very early stages at startup. And as I said, of our 12, 10 of them have to go through this process of phase 1 and startup, and then going to phase 2 of really just being nascent new trust funds that have to do outreach, that have to design and test their grant making systems, and that have to do strategic planning. And then what we called consolidation, I think the report called institutional or something very close to that. And that's the really now operating trust fund building its report and its rapport, and then designing and evolving as it continues to grow. So we also did a very similar interaction. And I add again that at each stage, there were practice standards that were at various levels of usefulness in terms of telling the trust funds, showing the trust funds that other conservation trust funds had been through this, and this was what we knew to be the best practice for these aspects of the development of these processes. Next slide. And then the final stage that you would have seen in the green is where the CBF would go through a process of confirming the eligibility of the trust funds that we had helped to set up to receive CBF funds. And these characteristics that you see here are really the eligibility requirements for the CBF process and the CBF partnership agreements that we sign. And what I wanted you to note, for those of you who know the practice standards as well as we do, is that they really came from the design of the practice standards. They speak to being clear on your purpose, having a board with a civil society management, having a well-designed asset system, having a well-designed audit system, and as well to grants and management. So even in how we've designed the review and the assessment of the National Conservation Trust Funds for CBF funding, we did in fact lean heavily on the on the practice standards. Next slide. The next step that we thought about is how do we really make this useful for the trust funds long term? And how do we continue to utilize the practice standards as we go forward and as the trust funds developed at various stages. And I know that Camila Montero is on the call. She's my partner in crime when we designed this at CBF. And I want to make sure and recognize her. What we did was to use the practice standards that existed and really ask the trust funds themselves to begin to rank themselves along those practice standards. And I just gave you one to show you how it would work. The idea was that the trust funds, I think it did two things. I think the first thing it did was for standards that they had not yet reached, which we made sure to say was, okay, your new funds just starting out, but it at least showed them the various aspects of best practices in conservation trust funds that they should be aiming for. And then it began a process of asking them to rank themselves, which is the idea behind the self-assessment, and ask the question of where we are this year on in terms of the standards. The other thing I would note is that it varied in years in some of the standards. Staff changed, board members changed, level of knowledge of board members or staff may have changed. So I think to say it's a score would not be correct, but I think it was a useful document, certainly for us to see where their strong points were and where they had developed more in terms of the practice standards, as well as I mentioned before, for the board and the staff themselves to see where they have changed, grown in most cases, I would have to say, but certainly had made differences from their last standard. And so what they got as the final document, next slide, were these web diagrams, which I know Camila knows very well. And as you can see, we did them very well, 2017, 2018, and 2019. And so far, I'll go ahead and blame COVID on 2020, but also this changing of the practice standards. So what we will do is work on continuing this process with the trust funds that we're working with. You can click again, Luisa, and what you come up with is an average of where the trust funds are for each of the practice standards. You can see, for example, that we haven't even added grant management because at the time in 2019, a lot of our trust funds were just starting that. So that is how we utilized the practice standards. In terms of the use of the new practice standards, I will be leaning on Camila and the rest of the working group to make sure that it integrates and considers the web diagrams and designs and the results that we got from years 2017 to 2019 and works to develop and continue to be able to demonstrate the results going forward in a way that works for consolidating and integrating the past practice standards, which I think, as you heard in the presentation, they were very good at. So we look forward to continuing to use the practice standards. We think that, you can go ahead to the next slide. We think that they are excellent in terms of the development and next steps. We were happy to be involved. The National Conservation Trust Funds are, in the scheme of things, micro trust funds, very small staff, very small board, and I think even at the size and status that they are, which is varied between them, they have found value in the practice standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Amazing example of how CBF has used these practice standards for the full development of a whole list of conservation trust funds in the region. So thank you for sharing that example with us. I would now like to pass this on to Vanessa Hartman, who will speak from a donor perspective. And before she gets started, just to remind you to please use the chat here to ask any questions that you might have for Karen, Viviana, Paquita, or Vanessa. Thank you, Karen. Vanessa, sorry.
Thanks a lot. I hope everybody can hear and see me now. I was facing some issues with the technology as always. Okay, looks like everything working fine. So yes, I'm Vanessa Hartmann. I am a portfolio manager at the German development bank KfW, and I am primarily responsible for regional marine conservation projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in this role, I am actually mostly working with regional conservation trust funds at the moment, such as the CVF that we just heard about. And today, I would like to give you an idea about the relevancy of the practice standards for KfW. So I will be presenting parts of the KfW project preparation and appraisal process. I think some people do have their microphone on, but I will just continue. Yeah, so I will basically be highlighting the KfW requirements and how adapting the practice standards might be very useful in fulfilling the prerequisites for becoming a KfW partner CTF. So if you could go on, Lisa. Thank you. And just very few words about KfW to start with. KfW Development Bank is a promotional bank of the Federal Republic of Germany. And we work for the German government, but also other clients such as the European Commission, and work with both government institutions as well as NGOs in our partner countries. And in conservation financing and conservation trust funds have become a very important implementing partner over the past years. If you could go on. Thank you. Yeah, so basically this map shows the CTF KfW is currently working with. Unfortunately, it's in German, but what it does give you an idea about the regional focus that we're having. So we're mostly working with CTFs in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean at the moment. KfW is working with a total of 19 CTFs with a volume totaling 628.5 million euros. These can be either national CTFs, regional CTFs, such as the CBF, or also global CTFs, such as the Blue Action Fund that some of you might know. The projects KfW is implementing with these CTFs vary between contributions to their endowment capital for enabling long-term conservation financing, contributions to sinking funds, and also we're working with CTFs as financial intermediaries or implementation agencies for our projects on the ground. So depending on the type of project, the prerequisites for receiving KfW funding might of course vary. Generally speaking, however, the practice standards do reflect very well the kind of questions we are investigating in the phase of project preparation and appraisal. If you could please go on. So I'm not going to go into detail on this slide, but what it shows in very general terms is the project cycle, starting with the project idea up to the project implementation at the very bottom. So in the preparation phase, KfW is basically responsible for assessing the feasibility of a project and doing the due diligence, which forms the basis for the project approval by the German government. And as part of the project appraisal, we do of course examine the project logic, theory of change of the project, and also the alignment with the strategies of the German government and also the partner governments, of course. But besides that, a very integral part of the appraisal is the due diligence of what we call the project executing agency, which in this case would be the CTF. And this is really where the practice standards come in. Can you go on? So what you can see on this slide are selected topics that KfW investigates as part of the due diligence and how these relate to the practice standards. So there is, for instance, a very close relationship between the standards for governance and the analysis of the institutional and legal framework that KfW is doing in the course of the appraisal. So in this analysis, we examine whether the legal form and the fundamental documents legitimize the CTF for its functions in the context of the project, whether appropriate and functional structures and regulations are in place. And also we look at the governing documents such as the Articles of Association. For the analysis of the organizational and human capacity of the CTF, we examine operational documents such as the operations manual and procurement processes, which are very important. For the bank, we look at past annual audits and also require those annual audits, of course, for the time of project implementation. And also we investigate personnel capacities, work conditions, and the organizational structure of the CTF. Monitoring and evaluation is very crucial for tracking the progress of the KfW projects, which is why there is a special emphasis on M&E and M&E systems of the CTF during the project appraisal. So you see there's a very strong link to the standards for institutional effectiveness programs and administration that were mentioned before. As many of you know, a lot of international donors do require the compliance with international environmental and social standards in all of their projects, and so does, of course, KfW. An environmental and social impact assessment is a very crucial part of the project preparation and appraisal, and the adherence to those standards is subject to regular monitoring during the project implementation. So as a precondition, KfW requires an environmental and social management system, ESMS, from all CTFs that we're working with. And I mean, this is a very different topic. I'm not going to go into detail here, but there is, as you can see, a very clear relation to the standard for risk management and safeguards that was now newly introduced. So lastly, it is absolutely essential that the sustainability of our KfW projects is ensured. And of course, the understanding of sustainability does vary very much depending on the project we're talking about. However, when it comes to CTFs, the preservation of the endowment capital is key for the long-term financing of its operations, as you know. So during appraisal, we look at how the governing documents ensure that the endowment capital does remain untouched and that its value, that its real value is preserved. Besides this, the CTF's capacity to mobilize resources is, of course, also linked to its long-term sustainability, since it's basically the second big source of income. So it's very crucial that a resource mobilization strategy is in place. We also look at investment policies and practices of the CTF, how funds have been managed in the past, and who is responsible for their investment. Since ensuring the correct use of funds is a very fundamental task that KfW is doing. So there's a clear link here as well with the standards for resource mobilization and asset management. I'm going to come to an end. I just want to mention once more, as it was done before, that some standards are, of course, more or less relevant depending on the different stage of maturity a CTF is in, and also depending on the kind of project we're implementing. I also have to mention, of course, that the adherence to the practice standards is no guarantee to receive funding, since we are, of course, bound to the priorities and the directives of the German government. Nevertheless, we do think that the practice standards provide a very important tool for responding to our internal requirements when we reach the stage of project appraisal. And we do, of course, encourage CTFs to adapt the practice standards to the extent possible from a very early stage of operation. So that brings me to an end. Thanks a lot for the attention, and very much looking forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vanessa, for your insight and for seeing how these tools can actually be very applicable for due diligence process with the different conservation trust funds. Thank you. We will now open it up for questions. Please feel free to use the chat section to write down your question, which I will then direct to the different participants. In the meantime, since we still don't have any questions and we only have a little time left, I would like to ask a question to Paquita or Viviana, either one of you who wants to answer. As part of these studies that you have done with the CTFs, you investigated how many of the CTFs have actually been using these practice standards in the past. How many of these do you have responded that they have found it useful What did your research find in terms of the usefulness that these CTFs found for the practice standards?
I'll go ahead and start on that one, Zdenka. There's no question that the work that Barry Spergel and Kathleen Mickelton did on the 2014 standards really raised the bar for conservation trust funds around the globe. People truly appreciated them. It gave them a sense of how they could improve over time. We interviewed over 50 CTFs, and about that many responded to the overall survey that we did across for both the tenure review and the practice standards. And all the conservation trust funds were extremely interested in this. So very high regard from the conservation trust fund community for these standards.
Thank you. Viviana, is there something you would like to add?
I think I'll have to go back to you with the exact number, because I'm almost sure we asked that question in the questionnaire. But if I remember correctly, I think the majority of the 50 used them in one way or another, either to set up the fund, to do an assessment at a certain time, to show to donors that they were compliant with the donors' requirements. So I think that they're in general very widely used. I think we were surprised when there was a CTF that told us, I don't know what the practice standards are, or I've never used them, because that was the less common answer.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Byron Swift, and it says, how do you suggest evaluating effectiveness of the CTF programs? This tends to be somewhat independent of process requirements, like the ones listed here. Who would like to take on that question? Maybe we can start with Paquita, and then maybe Vanessa can speak from the point of view of a donor in terms of effectiveness versus process requirement.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. You know, there's a couple levels of effectiveness for CTFs. I believe the practice standards do a good job of covering the asset management part of the effectiveness equation. All of us know that conservation organizations across the boards, not just conservation trust funds, are really struggling with the wicked problems of conservation and how difficult it is to have strong monitoring and evaluation for program results over time. REDLAC, all of the different networks and CFA, you know, are all struggling with these issues. I don't believe that the practice standards it has very good process pieces on monitoring and evaluation, Byron, but I fully understand that it may not get to the level of effectiveness that all of us would like to get to. What we're seeing in a number of conservation trust funds, such as, to give some credit to Zdenka and Costa Rica Forever, are using the open standards and taking advantage of all the work of the Conservation Measures Partnership. So we're seeing more and more conservation trust funds using those. But at the same time, as Viviana stated, we weren't trying to tell people how to do things. We were just providing ideas on the types of things they should look at. But I would suggest that on the effectiveness side, that is another way to go.
Great. Vanessa, is there something you would like to add in terms of how KFW measures effectiveness versus process requirement?
Sure, I cannot start my video, but that should be Kumar doing that for me. So basically, what I can add here is the kind of the approach that we're taking for our projects. So we do, of course, monitor the project based on the logical framework that is being prepared and developed at the very early stage of project preparation. So that gives us an exposed idea of how effective our projects are. Like I said before, we do have different mechanisms, different types of projects that we're implementing with the CTF. So I think it's a bit hard to generalize here, but generally this is our tool for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of our projects, both with CTFs and other implementing partners.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Since we're running out of time, I have one more question before we wrap up, and this would be a question for Karen. So tell us, Karen, from the perspective of the CBF, since you're using this tool both at the scale of each one of the conservation trust funds, have you also applied this tool at the scale of the CBF as a regional fund, and what are the results?
Thank you for the question. And yes, indeed, the work that we did, we consider the entire architecture, as we call it, which is the CBF, the regional entity, as well as the national entities. And indeed, I think the results for the CBF in some ways are similar as a new and starting organization. I think with the support that we have and the team that we have, the funding that we've gotten, we've moved through the stages a little quicker. So we are further along. We have the support for the financial aspects much more clearly defined because we have external support for that than the trust funds have. So I would say that it has been useful in also directing the CBF, and in some ways very similar in terms of what the board has asked for and what we've been able to show them as useful in terms of the practice standards. But at the regional level and with the support that we've had, we have been able to move through a number of those stages quicker. And we have gotten a lot of the self-assessments of the practice standards well sorted for that process. So it's been very a useful document for us as well.
Thank you. And thank you all of you for all of your input into this first webinar. We hope that this has been useful for all of you. Again, we will be seeing all of you every month as we discuss each one of these practice standards in detail and give you specific examples of how they're being applied by the conservation trust funds around the world. Thank you very much for joining us. We will let you know ahead of time so that you can all register for our next webinar next month. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.